we have already got Major General Ashok Mehta from India. Please ask your question. I have mics, I guess.
Thank you. Hello, yeah. Thank you very much. First, brilliant presentations, absolutely brilliant. I consider this one of the best sessions, not that the others were any less. I would start by making a comment, and the comment would be directed at the first speaker. The comment relates to what Henry Kissinger said many years ago, that when insurgents do not lose, they win. When armies do not win, they lose. Because he made a comment about which Henry Kissinger wouldn't be very happy about. My second intervention is a question, or rather two questions, briefly, again to the first speaker, Dr. David. And the question relates to Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka, which he mentioned briefly, is the only country in the 21st century to have defeated terrorism and insurgency in a very comprehensive manner. And so the question is, in which of these three categories that he listed, because I think Sri Lanka is a case apart and requires much greater study than has been the case. The Sri Lankans have studied it from 2011 till 2015. They showcased during defense seminars, which I had the privilege to attend, the reasons for that success. It's a mixed story, but I leave that where it is. And my second observation is on Nepal.
We can't hear. Yes.
Yeah, I'm resurrected for... Hello? Am I? Hello, yes. This is final rejuvenation. In your second, in your illustration of infiltrative insurgency, you've quoted Nepal. And I mean, this high technology. Am I okay now? All right. In your example on Nepal, where you've talked about infiltrative insurgency, I think that requires a little more study, because it was the defeat of the Maoists at the Battle of Kara which really made them change their strategy from capturing power militarily to joining the political mainstream, and their effort to capture power through subversion was defeated for many reasons, including the attempted sacking of the army chief, General Katwal. So I leave it at that because since you are an academic, you might like to reinvestigate this. There is a lot more than meets the eye in the case of Nepal. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for those comments. That's very useful and also very thought-provoking. I'll try to respond to your various points in order. I think Kissinger perhaps was a little bit too pessimistic. In a sense, so long as we're able to routinely clear insurgent areas and structures, I think we actually managed to contain the threat fairly well. Not well, but at a manageable level. And we can see this occurring, of course, with ISIS, as I mentioned during my presentation, in Iraq and also in Syria, despite the civil war that's going on there. But also, of course, in Asia, when ISIS splinter group tried to claim Marawi in the Philippines as their city, they were routed by the armed forces of the Philippines, at the cost of the city, or at least parts of it. But nonetheless, there is now no ISIS splinter group in Marawi. Similarly, though NATO forces did many things wrong in Afghanistan, when we actually committed to engage with the Taliban, we were able to clear quite effectively, and presumably we could go on doing that for some time, political will being there. Similarly, in the DRC, the United Nations is again failing at much, but again, we can clear groups like M23 when we actually are faced with a military target to do so. The French effort in Mali against AQIM is another case in point. So the problem for insurgents is, I feel like they may not lose entirely, but they certainly are not winning either. And I think that for some insurgents, that sort of stalemate pattern won't be enough. And they're going to try to find new ways of achieving more sustainable political power, hence the three methods that I discussed in my presentation. So Kissinger may perhaps be a little bit too pessimistic in his outlook. Now, for Sri Lanka, I actually did not want to focus on it too much because I think this is such a wonderfully international gathering, and who am I to speak about the political fortunes of the host nation government. But I think really what one has to look at here is what LTTE attempted and for a long time succeeded in prosecuting is perhaps best thought of as a localized insurgency. And of course, what ended it, I would say, was not a remarkably successful counterinsurgency campaign, but rather a successful civil war, which was prosecuted in the way that civil wars typically are, that is to say, largely conventionally. LTTE fatally maneuvered itself into a place where it could be defeated by conventionally military force, which is a good news story, of course. The question now is, what's going to be the next wave? Now that the military effort has been completely terminated, is there scope for, say, an ideational insurgency conducted perhaps through diaspora networks and unfolding in the virtual domain? Who's to say? On Nepal, I think that's an interesting perspective. I will just quote directly from one of the leading Maoist ideologues, Baburam Bhattarai, in this staggeringly honest admission that he made in an interview, when he says, "We have not abandoned the path of protracted people's war. What we have done is suspended that part of the activity. After some time, we will be able to combine both aspects of protracted people's war and general insurrection to mount a final insurrection to capture state power." I think that is straight from the horse's mouth, an indication that they're pursuing this sort of infiltrative system whereby they're using the ideals of democracy and peace really to, again, tear the guts out of both. Certainly it's something that concerns me, though it doesn't appear to concern many of the observers from international organizations and other civil society bodies.
Well, thank you very much. Our next question is from Mr. Shafqat Muni from Bangladesh. Please be brief in your, when you ask questions, since we are hard pressed for time.
Thank you, Chair.
Yes.
I have a quick couple of questions. First one is for General Odato. You made an important point in your one of your slides about communities recognizing the militants as offenders. While I broadly agree with your point, but one could also argue that stigmatization by the community also leads to a problem in reintegration and rehabilitation. So I would be keen to know your comments on that. And to General Noble, thank you for articulating what you see as the military's role in CVE and giving the US perspective. What I would like to know from you, General, is that what sort of evolution is required, therefore, in military training and education? As we envisage a greater role for military in CVE, particularly in information operations, what kind of evolution in military training and education is required? Thank you.
Could you please clarify what was your questions? The mic, yeah. Regarding the community.
The point I was trying to make, your point has been that the community needs to recognize militants as offenders. But one could also provide a counter-argument that in order for militants to be successfully reintegrated and rehabilitated back in society, stigmatization by the community or a continual acknowledgement of them as offenders does not help either.
Sure, no, I didn't want them to be stigmatized. I think that there is a need for a process of rehabilitation that will begin in prison and will maintain among society. Both the inmate himself, or the terrorist in that case, and the community should acknowledge that what he has done was wrong. That was the point. And then with his will and with their acknowledgement and assistance for him, he might be rehabilitated in the right way. Did I answer your question? Thank you.
Thank you.
Work? Can you hear me? Yeah. That's a great question. So the US view is that the essence of success rests with the people. Therefore, the training and education is fundamentally important. The world we're confronting is driving a first principles look at that. And I'd say to you that the first step is at the conceptual level. So the US Army, US Marine Corps concept for the future is called multi-domain operations. So there's been an argument, discussion about how do you make that reality? That then tears down into, therefore, what are the skill sets and expertise you require in your organisations? Which really gets to question everything. Is your command and control right? Does a modern infantryman need to also be a combat cameraman? That's ongoing in the US Army. And you mentioned information operations. So I was just at Leavenworth at the Information Operations School. And there's a dialogue about what is information operations, how wide is it, who executes it. So for example, traditionally it's been on the side. You do maneuver operations, then you do information operations to support maneuver operations. Reality is showing us it's in the center. Maneuver operations and information operations are together. So I think it's a work in progress, but you're seeing changes in courses, skills and requirements and the roles and responsibilities of the various branches. What an infantry officer will be, what an armour officer might be in the future. And then the last point is, for the US, the belief is you've got to leverage the people. The advantage is the soldiers, the NCOs and the junior officers. So you need to build a system that allows them to seize an opportunity and has freedom of action and doesn't centrally control everything, including things like cyber. And I think yesterday you saw one example of a delegation of cyber authority from the President to Cyber Command. There's a dialogue about should it go lower, and if so, how would you do that? So that would be my answer.
Thank you. Our next question is from General Bikram Singh from India.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear.
Right. I have a couple of comments to make. One is, firstly, with regard to the first two speakers. Is it audible? Can you hear me? Is it?
Better, yeah.
Right. The first thing is about, I got an impression that perhaps the criminal activities being undertaken by individuals is being clubbed as insurgency. Insurgency is a movement. It's an uprising. That's one thing. Because, gave a couple of examples. The lady also gave an example of a lone wolf. Now, a lone wolf, there have been a number of instances, but unless that lone wolf is supported by a larger group and is doing that, violent act as a result of, either religious or ideological or political agenda, it does not become a classic lone wolf terrorist, incident. That's the first point I had. So I think there's an important need to understand. While I must say the presentations have been excellent, and I think your research work is highly laudable, but I thought this point perhaps needs to be gone into that. In these kind of activities, ladies and gentlemen, I feel the population is the center of gravity. Terrorists can only operate if the population is with them. Devoid of population, they cannot operate. And if I can quote the United States, definition on center of gravity, it is the characteristic capability or source of power from which the terrorists derive their strength, freedom of maneuver, and will to fight. So it's the will to fight, and the strength comes from the population toward terrorists. And the military forces, the security forces, the whole of government approach is involved in winning the hearts and minds of that population to make sure the operations which actually at times antagonize the population, they are with the governmental agencies. And terrorists, on the other hand, through intimidation, through luring, through inducing people, try and put the population towards their side. So the common factor in this kind of war fighting is the population, the first thing to be understood. The second I want to give is that, we had a presentation of the United States, and I've had a great experience on this. This was my thesis at the US Army War Colleges again. We cannot afford to be aping the American model blindlessly. And I want to bring out certain points which need to be remembered because there are a large number of delegates here who are facing this problem at home. First thing, United States is operating OCONUS, outside continental United States. When you operate within your country, fighting this kind of war fighting, subconventional war fighting, asymmetric war, hybrid war, please understand the rules of engagement are different. You resort to calibrated use of force because, as I said, population remains the center of gravity. Now, in your case, since you're operating outside continental United States, there are no holds barred with regard to the use of force. And therefore, you people resort to, the use of your drones and whatnot. That's what you've been doing on the Afghanistan border. You kill 2 terrorists, but you antagonize 10 people or 10 families because their 10 collateral damage is so much that you are taking 2 steps forward and 10 backwards. So this is one aspect I wanted to give, that perhaps precision in the use of firepower, calibrated use of firepower, minimal use of firepower is something which is sine qua non to win this kind of a campaign. And population, of course, has to be taken into account. The other thing is that, US is known for, and I'm sorry to say this, I'm a graduate of the US Army War College, for leaving, the missions, the campaigns halfway through. You've got to take your campaigns to a logical conclusion. And the most difficult portion, which is the drain on the national economy, is the last phase, and that's the transition phase. Everyone gets into decisive ops and all that kind of thing. But the point is, it's the last phase, which is the reconstruction phase of the country, where people should not de-link. We have done it post-haste in Iraq. We have done it post-haste in Afghanistan, and the result, you are going to be creating mayhem and a lot of turbulence in these areas. And this turbulence is going to proliferate, you take it from me. So therefore, there's a need for the international community, people seated here, to go back with this idea that we got to put our act together, all of us be together to make sure we contribute to the upliftment and to address the basic aspirations of these Iraqis, of Afghanistan, and also to ensure that we empower. Because SSR is the most important thing. I'm using the term which is used by the United Nations, the security sector reforms. That is where we got to now, all of us chip in, give our contributions to empower the police, the security forces of those countries. That was the next point. And well, I think this is all that I had based on the one point about LTT. You make a mention about LTT every time. I think 2 things were, I would say, at the strategic level, very important. One is that you should be able to isolate the area of conflict. And by the virtue of Sri Lanka being an island, you had seas all around and you could isolate the area of conflict. That's number one. Because up north, these guys were there and, the security forces, the government resources were able to isolate them. That's very important, which is not possible in many of the cases because you find land borders being porous, you'll find balloon effect. You carry out operations at one place and the balloon will, blow up on the other place. So people keep moving from place A to B, the terrorists, and that is one reason that the LTT remnants have totally disappeared, because neither our country supported, nor any land, countries which are close by supported, and the sea, of course, they couldn't have, carried out their activities in. The second point is about the information operations. I'm sorry, I'll just take a minute more. The last point is about information operations. These wars, these conflicts can only be won, subconventional wars, if you are able to regulate. And I know this is against human rights, this is against democratic norms. Media is the fourth estate, it's the fourth pillar of any democracy. People would not accept it. But unless there is an understanding that you got to regulate the media, you cannot win this conflict. And I've got my personal experience of El Salvador, Nicaragua, Congo. You take any other insurgency, you take, for example, even in India, you take Punjab, you take Sri Lanka. Unless you have a regulated media, you cannot take this campaign to a logical conclusion, because with all my respect to the media thrives on an adversarial role. So you try and show something, they will portray it in the other manner and perhaps start dissecting what you have done. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. Shall we take 2 more questions? Then all 3 presenters can answer. We have Major General D.I. Karunaratne from Sri Lanka and Colonel Ayman F. Tafa from Egypt. Major Karunaratne? Yes.
Good morning to you. This goes to General Adato. It's a very short question. Ma'am, in your presentation, you highlighted with regard to the rehabilitation process in 2 forms. One is inside prison, and the other one is outside the prison. I would like to know whether these 2 mechanisms are the same, or this has been done separately, or the outside prison rehabilitation is a follow-up action of inside rehabilitation, and what is the end state of these 2? Is it the same or 2 different end states? Thank you.
Next question, Colonel Taha from Egypt.
Okay, sir. Thank you for my question for Lieutenant General Adatutu. You, ma'am, mentioned extremism religious first, and you go first for extremism Islam and Islam only. My question is there any other religious has its extremism, and those extremists don't have the fun till now, maybe brand new 4x4 cars and brand new weapons? This is my question. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
I'll begin. As for this first question, General Indian, a lone wolf is a barely new phenomena. The world was used to have terror organizations. Now, a lone wolf doesn't need a network. He does need an atmosphere. And the atmosphere could be based on ideological, religious, frustration, whatever. But it is lone wolves. And there is a research that shows that about 50-something% of them has some minor mental problems. So it is different from what we have known in the past. It is a real new phenomena. As for the second question, there is links between inside and outside prison, but the way to recruit is different, because when you are in prison, you are very vulnerable, and if there are some people over there that try to recruit you, they might do it, and they might not be willing or succeed to do that. Outside, there is a network, there is an internet, darknet, incitement in any other places. So this is something that happens in a different way. But the question, if there is relation between the inside and the outside, I think I've mentioned it. The atmosphere is very important. If he comes out when he is radicalized, he is out now. So outside, he might be a lone wolf and operate an attack. The other one doesn't have to be in prison, but if he has been radicalized as well, they will not meet with each other unless they had some connection in the past. But it's 2 phases of the same problem. As for our Egyptian colleague, yes, you are right. There are others. You remember the Crusaders. So what we are facing now mostly is radical Islamic, extremism of Islamic. That's what I meant. It doesn't mean that there hasn't been in the past and there will not be in the future. You know what? Even in our country, there are extremist Jews that we are dealing with them at the same way, that are looking around and trying to operate against Arabs. So this is also terrorism. This is also religious-based, or in a way, even territorial, national, but mostly religious-based terror. Thank you.
Well, thank you for those comments and questions. Talking first about this notion of criminal insurgency, of course, I agree with you that most criminal enterprises have nothing to do with insurgency because they don't have that movement, as you referred it to. They operate instead in a clandestine manner, hiding out from law enforcement. But where these criminal gangs own people, where they rely on the cooperation and control of entire communities, where they are involved in providing rudimentary government services, whether it's taxation, local service delivery, essential services, arbitration, and so on and so forth, I feel like we're dealing with a different beast. Because here we're talking about then criminals who are hiding not in clandestinity, but really among their own community. They employ kids as scouts to signal the arrival of law enforcement. They even are seen by those forgotten communities perhaps as their representatives because the state has simply left. And so here, I think the term criminal insurgency is actually quite apt, because we are then talking about a contest of perceptions of legitimacy, very much in the same vein as we do when we speak about conventional insurgencies. Now, not every gang will evolve in this direction, and there's some great scholarship suggesting the sort of precursor conditions for that particular adaptation, but some have. Comando Vermelho in Rio's favelas, for example, is one case study that I'm very familiar with and I've written on, and I think it's an instructive case in point. So that's why I would say that there is a certain validity to this notion of criminal insurgency, even though I agree that typically and traditionally criminality and the mass movement of insurgency have some distance between them. Moving on to the LTTE case and your two comments on there, I mean, I think you're right. Of course, it helps if you're an island, but I don't think that we should be too complacent even about that sort of precondition. Because, of course, these days, the connective tissue doesn't need to be geographic or physical. It can also be virtual. And I think that brings into effect this component or phenomenon of lone wolves. I agree with you that the term is, in a sense, very unsatisfying. In fact, lone wolves, in a sense, is almost an oxymoron. Because if there are many wolves acting out in the same ideology, are they still alone? I would argue the case is no. So I agree with you. This is a problematic concept. But nonetheless, as we move towards ideational insurgency, whether you're an island or not may not matter so much. And of course, also, even though you're an island, you still have a regional context to play with. And I think, not to dig up old stories here, but of course, India did have a role in the sort of the longue durée of the Sri Lankan conflict. So again, we're not as hermetically sealed, even as islands, as perhaps we might like to think we are. On the information ops and the need for a regulated media, I think you're right. That obviously helps. The canonical case of counterinsurgency, the British Malayan campaign of the 1950s, one of the key enablers of that success was the ability to basically stamp out any local media, to shut down the newspapers. But I think today, we just got to keep on dreaming. That is not going to happen. First of all, I think traditional media is simply not the most relevant forum through which to communicate to the relevant and contested populations. And secondly, there are so many broadcasters and so many receivers and so many audiences that we were just unable. I think the more we try to suppress it, the worse it will look. So we have to rethink and come up with some more innovative strategies to get at this. And I think a good starting point is a book co-authored by a very good friend of mine, Thomas Ridd, called War 2.0, where he looks at 3 non-state armed groups and 3 state actors and the ways in which they've tried to incorporate Web 2.0 within their warfighting strategies. I agree with you completely on the faith in the strategic utility of the use of force. I think that's one of the overarching problems in our prosecution of modern counterinsurgency. And again, that's something that I try to comment on in my talk. So yes, I think that's still an overriding problem. Thank you.
I think to the second question, I'm not sure I understood it fully, but I'd say this to you. There's a very deliberate reason the United States uses the term violent extremist organizations, because it encompasses all violent extremist organizations and individuals, not Islamic fundamentalist violent extremists. They fit inside that potentially. So it might be religious, it might be political, it might be cultural, it might be criminal. But that's the use of the term. So Timothy McVeigh, who blew up the building in Oklahoma, was a very large white American man. He's a violent extremist. He fits under that definition, as does al-Baghdadi and his boys. So that's how I'd respond. And that's considered, and that's why it's used. One thing for the general, the thing I really agree with, most of the things that you said are absolutely correct, including each country decides its own strategy in its own time, in its own conditions. The United States is not advocating everyone copy the United States. The United States is, I think, advocating buy into the worldview and the approach to the extent that you should or could. So that's how and the only thing I'd contest is OCONUS, the US does not adopt a no-holds-bar use of force. I was a target engagement authority in Iraq for a year. I think you would be staggered at the controls they put in place on the use of force. The real problem is when you fight an organised, effective enemy operating in a big population in an urban centre where there's lots of people, the use of force is always high risk. And so when you do kill a civilian who's a non-combatant that you don't want to kill, the ramifications for that are significant in a counterinsurgency. So one of the challenges for militaries is how do you use force in a controlled way, still be effective, and protect the civilian population and non-combatants. And I can tell you, it's very difficult, as you probably know from your own experience.
Thank you. There's one more question, Mr. HMGS Paliakara.
Do you hear me? Oh, yes. Okay. Actually, this I would like any or all of the panelists to make their observations, but it concerns a point made by my good friend General Ashok Mehta. When he speaks, of course, one takes notice, especially concerning Sri Lanka. And the point relates to some of the observations made by the first speaker, Dr. David. I agree with Ashok that it's not easy to package all insurgencies or terrorist movements into the three groupings that he mentioned, but I do agree that it is a very good attempt at conceptually describing the kind of a list we have on various insurgencies. My point is that I disagree with Dr. David that somehow the military operation against the LTTE was not a counter-insurgency operation, but something akin to a civil war. Reason being that the operation was launched after a prolonged effort at political negotiations, which clearly showed that LTTE was not interested in a political compromise, but that they have to be shown that, like what Kissinger was saying, that they cannot win, and that that is how the military operation. If that military operation transformed itself at the last stages into a conventional warfare, that was a different issue. But it wasn't a kind of a civil war that, as you put it. So my question actually is, the post-LTTE, the conflict, as it were, conflict by other means that we see with the diaspora and all that, do you see any chance of what you described as a second coming, if I captured that word correctly, second coming of war, not war in the sense of military conflict, but conflict by other means resurfacing? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. My first sort of caveat, if you will, is that the three approaches that I talked of are just that. They're just three approaches. And I don't make any claim to suggest that all insurgents will fit within that particular template or typology. Rather, I find these particular approaches to be especially salient in overcoming the insurgent's dilemma that I try to present. But absolutely, there'll be many that don't go that way or may even succeed in other ways. So therein lies, of course, a whole wide universe of complexity. On whether it was a civil war or a counterinsurgency campaign, I think is perhaps mostly a question of how we define things. I think that LTTE started out as a terrorist group. It was able to amass sufficient support to really act as an insurgency with its own counterstate. I would personally say that given the nature of the hostilities that went down, and also given the nature of LTTE as an organization, the final battle was very much akin to a civil war, similar in some ways to what we saw in the United States between the North and the South. But we can talk definitions later. I guess the real question is, does it matter what we call it? And we can continue that conversation, I think, for some time. Whether there will be a second coming of sort of Tamil militancy, I think there are probably any number of people in this room who will be better placed to answer that question than me. From my very limited vantage point, I think we need to return to the political essence of these struggles. And there is perhaps, I don't see any high likelihood of a renewed military threat anytime soon from sort of a reborn Tamil organization. However, I think in a world in which information operations and narratives play an increasingly important part, there is always the risk of losing the narrative or losing control of the story. And particularly internationally, I think you all are aware that there was a lot of concern about the final hostilities, whether that concern is well placed or not, whether it's justified or not. It is a reality, and it's a reality that I think that if you want to win the narratives, it has to be dealt with head on. So therein lies, I think, ammunition for a renewed sense of militancy and perhaps an empowerment of sort of neo-Tamil extremist groupings. But again, I say that knowing full well that I am less informed on this matter than I think most people in this room. Yes, I think I'll finish off there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me wind up this session by just making one comment. Dr. Wuko, you said there were two reasons for the defeat of recent movements. That is you say military backlash was too powerful for most of these, states. Secondly, global response. But if you go back, Russian Revolution, after the Russian Revolution, all the countries from four sides, Russia was invaded, but it was not successful. And Vietnam War, Viet Cong fighters did not plant bombs in various clubs and things like that. Even in Cuba's case, there was some discipline. But in recent terrorist movements, they have degenerated into terrorism and also, as yourself called, criminal insurgency. So it seems that the military backlash is a very important factor in defeating these terrorist groups. The other one was really the nature of these terrorist groups, it seems. So modern terrorism has that intrinsic weakness of degenerating into a situation where their own people will hate them. And this happened in the case of LTT in Sri Lanka also. Well, as you all agreed, we had an excellent session, 3 good presentations and a lot of very important questions. And let me thank the paper presenters as well as the audience for being active. Thank you very much.